Hello, Econ 175. Welcome to our first virtual lecture. So what I'm going to be doing is going over chapter 12. So this chapter is very intuitive. You just need to know a couple of important details about it. So we're going to go through the slides. And then for the next chapter, which is unemployment, for that I'm going to have practice videos working through problems and something that you could expect on the test. For this chapter, again, it's just a lot of intuitive. A lot of the stuff you probably already know, but now you're providing a solid foundation behind this. So we're going to start off by doing the lecture. So again, chapter 12 is production and growth. So we're looking at why there's a disparity between rich countries and poor countries, developed and lesser developed. What's the difference? So some of the questions you're going to want to answer are, what are the facts about living standards and growth rates around the world? So why are living standards so different between the United States and Mexico, or the United States and Iran, or the United States and China? So again, there's a huge disparity between these countries, and we're going to talk about those throughout this lecture. Why does productivity matter for living standards? Productivity is one of the most important things we look at, especially in macroeconomics. So how productive can your economy be, given your workers, your knowledge, your skill set, and so forth. And then we'll talk about what determines productivity and its growth rate, and how can public policy affect growth and living standards. So what I do in some of my other classes at different campuses, you choose a country. You see what's wrong with it, and you try to fix it. So there's different policies you can implement to help your economy grow. And at the end of the day, each economy's goal is to maximize growth and sustain this in the long run. If you're not doing this, then you're not doing your job in terms of an economy, and we'll talk about how that relates to things going on today. For example, the COVID-19 or the coronavirus, how this has an impact on growth. So we'll talk about that as well. And we'll look at numbers, more recent numbers, later on in this lecture. So first, we're going to look at an advanced economy. So an advanced economy is when you think of first world countries, that's what you think associated with. So here we have a typical family and all their possessions in the UK. So the GDP per capita at this point in time, I believe this is 2014, it's $39,000. So each GDP per capita is GDP per person. Child mortality rate is 0.4%. Now, the lower the mortality rate, the more your population is going to grow. Basically, the mortality rate is looking at children passing away before the age of 5. So if the number is low, we have a healthier population. People are living longer. Now, access to modern sanitation facilities is 100%. So again, you have access to better materials, which is good. It's much healthier, safer, and so forth. And then educational attainment is 60% in higher education. So this is basically saying 60% of the population is enrolled in higher education, which is really good. You want a higher number. This means your workforce is going to be much more advanced. They have more skills and so forth. So when you think of first world country, you think of, this is a perfect example. So higher GDP per capita, lower mortality rate, better sanitation facilities, and also higher education attainment. So it's cleaner, safer, and more educated. Now, we're going to look at Mexico. This is a middle income country. So their GDP per capita is 16,000. Again, a little bit less than half for Mexico compared to the UK. Child mortality rate is a bit higher, so it's 1.3%, saying that a little bit more children pass away before the age of 5. This could be due to healthcare infrastructure, lack of resources, and then also access to modern sanitation facilities, 85%. Now, all of Mexico isn't completely developed. There are places where they don't have access to adequate resources, so hence the lower number. And then educational attainment is 30%. So about 30% of their population has enrolled in higher education. Now, depending on what you value the most in terms of if you want to fix your country or if you want to put a country on the path of growth, there's different ways you can go about it. You can do something where you reduce your child mortality rate, saying if there's more people in our population, we're going to have a larger workforce meaning we can produce more GDP. If we focus on health and sanitation, the healthier the environment, the healthier our population, the longer they can work, the more we can produce. Also, you can go about education. So if you promote education, if you provide financial aid, if you provide an incentive to go get this higher education, they'll have more skills, more innovation, being able to produce more at a smarter rate. There's different ways you can go about it. Now, a typical family in Mali, this is a small country in Africa, their GDP per capita is roughly $1,500. So again, a very low amount. Child mortality rate is higher, so it's at 11.5%. So unfortunately, in this country, there a lot of children don't make it past the age of 5 again due to lack of resources, adequate healthcare resources, infrastructure, and so forth. And then access to modern sanitation facilities is 25%. So they have access to much less sanitary materials, facilities, and healthcare professionals to help them throughout their life. And educational attainment is much, much lower. So again, this is a lesser developed country. Less people are educated due to lack of money in their educational system or the importance of work at a young age. So a lot of kids don't go to school, so they don't have the value of education, or they can't afford to go to school in the most simplest of terms. So here we have a real GDP per person, so per capita from 1900, or some range from 1900 to 1890, all the way up to 2014. So at the beginning of the period and at the end of the period. And then here we have the growth rate per year. So the right-hand side, that's how we're growing per year. The higher the number, the more your economy is growing. You want your economy to grow. If your economy is growing, your GDP per capita is growing, meaning people are making more money, you're producing more. All in all, it is a good thing. So at the end of the period, you see numbers being much higher. So over time, what happens is societies become more advanced. You have more technology available to you, you have better sanitation, better living standards, better education. There's various things that are implemented into growth in the long run. Now, it's not always the case where countries can sustain this growth for extended periods of time. Sometimes there are hiccups. For example, COVID-19, this is having an impact on production. Or if it's a recession, that's another way of reducing your growth. But overall, our trends show over time, countries increase their GDP per capita. So if we look at China, in 1900, their GDP per capita was $762 per person. Now, at 2014, or in this data set, it's 16,000. So there's been it's 13,000. Sorry. Now there's been a huge increase because they've innovated their workforce, implemented new technologies, new policies, better healthcare. There's various things that have happened. And same thing with the United States. At the beginning of the period, it was roughly 4,200, and now we're roughly sitting at 55,000 in 2014. We'll look at how numbers have changed today. But historically, we've been growing roughly around 2%, give or take. Now, there's a couple other countries, mostly all these countries have grown. Now, Indonesia hasn't grown as much from 1900 to 2014, but for the most part, you do see growth. That's the main thing we're trying to get across. There's growth. There's different ways to implement this growth as well. So we're going to talk about the 2019 numbers. So I got this from the IMF. It'll just pull up. Okay. So IMF, it's the International Monetary Fund. It's a great place to get data if you're doing macroeconomic studies. So here on this left-hand side, we have a table or a chart visualizing what your GDP per capita in current prices in the US dollar all around the world. So this color right here, I want to say that's a teal. Correct me if I'm wrong. This color shows if your GDP per capita is 25,000 or more. And once you start looking at these countries, so you have Canada, you have the United States, you have Australia, you have Spain, you have France, the UK, Germany, Norway, Sweden. All these countries, when you think of them, it is a developed country. It is a advanced economy. They have certain rules, regulations. They have different healthcare infrastructure, education incentives set in place to help increase our GDP. So when you look at these countries, think of an example. So the United States is a great example, Australia, Germany, all the ones we've mentioned. Now this mint color is if your GDP per capita is from 10,000 to 25,000. So these are the middle income countries. So we have Mexico, Russia, China, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Poland, we have Romania. So all these countries are middle income countries, as well as Chile. So these countries, they're not at the advanced economy stage, but they do exhibit good characteristics. So they're on the path to growth. And now if we scroll down a little more, we have a little chart. It's dating back from 1980 all the way to 2020. So the countries I've plotted on this is Korea, the United States, China, Mexico, and Germany. Now, what you should notice overall is there's a positive growth. Now, there are some portions where you do see a decrease. So around 2008, 2009, you see an impact all over the world. So the United States, we did dip down a little, but we bounced back. Now, other countries felt this as well. Again, we're an integrated world economy, globalization. We have trade with different countries. All this plays a role. So if one country feels it, another country will feel the impacts. So for example, China or these other middle income countries, because of COVID-19, you see a decrease in production. If you see a decrease in production, GDP is going to go down. Now you're going to see these numbers decrease. So we will look at numbers before the end of the semester to see the impact of in the first quarter of the COVID-19, and we'll see how that has been affected due to lack of production, lack of jobs, people getting laid off. All this stuff is relevant, and it's sad to say, but it came at a good time in terms of showing how this has an impact on the economy. Again, it's unfortunate everything that we're going through, and everyone's taking the right precautions to reduce the impact, and hopefully we get our economy back on track, basically, as well as a lot of other countries. There are a lot of other countries that are that do depend on, let's just say, the United States or China for some of their products. So this is a trying time, and I assure you that we will get through all this, whether it be at the end of this semester, whenever it happens, it will happen. Okay, so we're gonna get back to our slideshow. All right, so economic growth around the world. There's a difference in growth rates because different countries have access to different resources. It's not every country has a large budget that they can spend for military, or a large budget they can spend on education, or a large budget for healthcare. So there's a huge difference, but there are countries that have shown that they were either a poor economy or a poor country, and they implemented the right steps, or steps that helped them achieve a higher GDP per capita. So a higher GDP per capita is good. You should always associate that with something good. You want to have a high GDP per capita. So an example of this would be, they're not stuck in poverty forever. Singapore is a great example. Korea is another great example. Singapore had a very low income in 1960, but they implemented different policies. Now they're becoming much more advanced, and they've been on this path to growth. Now, rich countries can't take their status for granted as well. They might be overtaken by poorer countries, but faster growing countries. Oh, they may be overtaken by poor but faster growing countries. So it's not always the case the United States is going to be the top dog till the end of time. There's other countries that have been catching up. For example, China is able to produce much more than us. Again, there's a lot of different reasons why that is, due to their access to resources. We're much more a service-based economy compared to them. But it's not always the case where one country stays up top till the end of time. So questions you should look to answer: why are some countries richer than others? Again, access to resources, education, healthcare, everything we've talked about up until this point. Now, why do some countries grow quickly while others seem to be stuck in a poverty trap? Now, this is going back to allocation of resources. Some countries aren't as efficient. They might be dealing with corruption. They might be dealing with a war or some type of conflict in the area. So there's a lot of things that hinder growth, and you don't. If you were in charge of a country, you would not want to be stuck in this trap. This trap is, a lot of countries are in this. For example, Venezuela, Syria, Iran. All these countries have dealt with corruption, conflicts, crime rates. All this stuff plays a huge role in this economic growth. Now, what policies may help raise growth rates and long-run living standards? So there's a lot of ways you can go about this. We'll talk about them. All right, so the first thing that is based on your living standard is your ability to produce goods and services. If you can't produce anything, your GDP is going to be zero. So just think about it. If we had 300 million people, let's just say in the United States, and no one was able to produce anything, our country's income would be zero. Now, you don't want that. You want to be able to produce stuff. You want to be able to sell, trade, all this stuff. So productivity is an important measure. So when you think of chapter 12, think of productivity. Now, productivity is a quantity of goods and service produced. Now, it's produced from each unit of labor input. So each worker, we're going to see how much they produce. Now, Y in this case is your real GDP or your output being produced. So something you do need to know for this chapter is output being produced. L is labor. So Y divided by L. So our GDP, this gives us our GDP per person, or how much each individual is going to produce. Now, a productive economy is going to have a much higher number. Each worker can produce more, meaning they add more to the total. Now, why is productivity so important? The key determinant of living standards. When a nation's workers are very productive, real GDP is large and incomes are high. So you want to have a high economy, or a high income in your economy. So overall, if we say in the United States here, each worker can produce much more, our living standards much higher, incomes are higher, we can enjoy more things compared to, let's say, a low income country. Now, growth in productivity is a key determinant of growth in living standards. So when productivity grows rapidly, so do living standards. Basically what I was saying, if you increase how much each worker can produce, you're going to increase overall GDP. So this is good. You want to have this. So if you think about ways, how can we produce more? So think of yourself in a third world country. When you think of yourself in a third world country, you most likely have access to less technology. If we implement new technology, you're going to have the ability to produce more. So just think about yourself at your job right now. Eliminate all the technology. So for example, let's say you are a chef at a pizza restaurant. Now, let's say you have no technology available to you. You have all the ingredients to make your pizza, but you have no pizza oven. You have no blender. You have no knife. You have no wood. This makes your job a lot harder. It's going to take you much longer time to produce this product if you have no technology. Now, let's say I introduce a blender. Now, let's say we introduce a knife. Now, let's say we introduce wood or a pizza oven. Now you become much more productive because you have more resources available to you. The more you have available to you, the more you can produce. So just think of it in terms of that. Or a job that you've had where, imagine you had no technology, it'd make your life a lot harder. The more technology we introduce, the more they'll be able to produce. All right, so now we're going to talk about other important factors of productivity. Physical capital. So K denotes physical capital. This is a stock of equipment and structures used to produce goods and services. So an example would just be what I was talking about. If you are a pizza chef and you are producing pizza, that's your main goal. If you don't have a pizza oven, it's going to make your life much harder. If you don't have a blender, you don't have a knife, you don't have certain tools needed to produce this product, it's going to make your life a lot harder. So the more access to physical capital that you have, or tools or infrastructure that you need to produce this product, the more you're going to produce. So we also look at physical capital per worker. This is looking at how much physical capital, how many tools, equipment, structures are available per worker. So the more capital we have available per worker, the more we can produce. So think about you and your job. The more machines you have, the more technology. Let's just say you're a cashier. If you had a cash register, you're going to be much more efficient compared to just doing everything by hand. Or if you're a chef, if you have much more tools in the kitchen to use, you're going to be much more productive. So the more capital you have available to you, the higher your physical capital per worker and higher your productivity. Technology helps you produce more. That's why we always say technology helps. And if you think of our supply and demand, if we see an increase in technology, your supply curve is always going to shift to the right because you can produce more now. You're more efficient. So an increase in K divided by L causes an increase in Y divided by L. So an increase in capital per worker. So if each worker has more equipment available to them or tools, they're going to be able to produce more per worker. All right, human capital. This is knowledge and skills workers acquire through education, training, and experience. So human capital is just denoted as H. So the more education you have, the more schooling you have, the more individual training that you have, you provide more human capital. You need human capital to be able to use these tools in an innovative way, in the most efficient way. You can't just expect to have these tools and automatically just know how to use them. You need to know, you need to understand what's going on, how to use it, when to use it, and so forth. So the more education, training, and experience an individual has, the more they can produce. So an increase in H divided by L causes an increase in Y divided by L, which basically is the more human capital per worker, or the smarter or more skills that an individual has, the more that they can produce per worker. Natural resources. All right, natural resources are inputs into production that nature provides, so land, rivers, mineral deposits. The more natural resources available per worker is also going to increase your output per worker. Basically, if you have more, let's say you're a country that produces lumber. If you have an abundant amount of trees, you're going to be able to produce much more per worker. So again, the more natural resources you have access to, the more you can produce. Again, you need natural resources to produce your product as well, whether it be land. So the more land you have available, the more you can produce. Let's just say you're a farming country. Now, the more access to arable land, the more you can produce in the long run. Technological knowledge. Society understanding the best ways to produce goods and services. If you don't have technological knowledge, or you don't know how to use your resources in the most efficient way, you're basically useless. You need to be able to use your physical capital combined with your human capital, combined with technological knowledge, all mushed together in order to produce something much more efficient. So technological progress means a faster computer, higher definition TV, or a smaller cell phone. This is because we understand how this technology works. We understand it and we can make improvements, and over time, this helps us in the long run. We can produce more. Now, example of this would be advance in knowledge that boosts productivity, allows society to get more output from its resources. And perfect example is Henry Ford. He, founder of the Ford company, obviously, he created the assembly line. Basically, everyone's doing a different task, or everyone's doing a select amount of people are doing a certain task, a select amount of people are doing a different task, and at the end of the day, you produce much more, as opposed to everyone doing everything. You're specializing. So here we understand the process, we understand how to produce a product. Each individual is doing, or each group of people are doing a certain task, and at the end of the day, we increase our productivity. So technological knowledge versus human capital. Technological knowledge refers to society's understanding of how to produce goods and services. So understanding how to use our machinery, how to use certain tools and improve. Human capital results from people's effort to acquire this knowledge. So human capital, think of education and training. Technological knowledge is understanding everything and being able to make improvements. Both are extremely important for productivity. All right, so I know a lot of students saw this slide, or I hope you saw this slide, and got really scared. I will not test you on this. I only want you to know this function. So this function is Y. Y is output. A is a level of technology. How much technology you have available to you. A higher level of technology, the more you can produce. The lower level of technology, the less you can produce. F, right here, denotes your function. Everything inside this function is a determinant on how much you produce, or in terms of output. Okay, so L, we already know, is labor. K, physical capital. H is your human capital.